The state of cargo security today. Tony Pelli is Practice Director for Security and Resilience with BSI. Tony, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Robert. Glad to be here.
Tony, where is the biggest threat to cargo security today? Let's start geographically. Where are we looking at the particular risks going on there?
Yeah, so within the United States, it's fairly consistent in terms of the areas that we see that are highest risk for cargo theft. It tends to be concentrated around major logistics hubs in the United States. So you see a lot of activity near the port of LA Long Beach and kind of throughout the greater Los Angeles area. You see a lot of activity in states like Georgia, for example, because of the port there as well. And a fair amount of activity in places like Texas, too, around the Dallas area. Southern Florida, Miami tends to see a lot of cargo theft activity as well. And then also the areas in New Jersey that are near the New York, New Jersey port. Looking out, kind of zooming out a little bit internationally, a bit more, we see that countries like Mexico and Brazil are highest risk for cargo theft in terms of the sheer number of incidents. Brazil typically experiences over 10,000 cargo theft incidents a year, compared to just a few thousand in the United States. Within Europe, we see a lot of incidents in Germany, the UK, and then Italy as kind of the highest risk countries there, although we do see incidents in places like Spain and France as well. Canada is kind of an interesting one that's seen a fairly dramatic increase over the past few years. And it's not clear why necessarily that increase is happening, but what you're seeing is traditionally you had cargo theft concentrated in the greater Toronto area. Now it appears that there's more cargo theft occurring in other parts of the country as well. Within Asia, India is an emerging country for cargo theft, seeing a lot more trade with India, a lot more manufacturing in India. So we're seeing a kind of a commensurate rise in cargo theft activity in that country as well.
What form are all of these incidents taking? Are they the outright theft of an entire vehicle? Is it breaking into trailers and containers? Is it at gunpoint? Is it when the drivers aren't attending their vehicles? Like what's the typical situation here?
Yeah, so it very much varies by region. Within Latin America, you see the majority of thefts are hijackings of trucks on the road using some fairly elaborate schemes there, dressing up as construction workers to stop cars, dressing up as police officers to stop cars. You see that kind of activity in South Africa as well, is another country where we see a fair amount of hijackings. And within Europe, Italy is probably one of the few countries that sees those types of hijackings, kind of outright armed robbery or armed in-transit thefts. What is more common throughout Europe is what we call slash and grab thefts. So in Europe, they use a lot of soft-sided trailers for aerodynamic reasons, fuel costs, lower weight, all that kind of stuff. Easier to load and unload on those kind of narrow streets that you see in Europe. And what we see is people slashing through those trailers in order to get to the cargo that's in there. And we've seen at rest stops, in Germany, for example, thieves will go through 30 trailers just looking for what's good in those trailers. Mm-hmm. India, we see a mix of those different cargo theft techniques. Within the U.S. and Canada, there's two forms of cargo theft that are predominant. You see full trailer theft or full truckload theft. So that's driver leaves the car running at a rest stop, goes inside for 5 or 10 minutes, maybe goes to take a shower or something like that. He comes out, his truck is gone. And you also see what we call fictitious pickup thefts, which is where thieves will either impersonate a trucking company, use a defunct trucking company, take their identity, use a real trucking company, steal their identity, or just show up with legitimate looking paperwork and saying, hey, I'm here to pick up this load. They'll show up early before the legitimate carrier.
Yeah, that one's interesting. How common is that these days versus all this other stuff you're talking about?
So it's increasingly common in the US and Canada. We see kind of isolated incidents of it in the UK, Germany, and other European countries, but it's increasingly common in the US and Canada, and especially in Canada. The increase that they've seen recently, including some kind of interesting thefts involving the theft of like hot tubs, for example, directly from the manufacturer, were carried out using this method. They show up with legitimate looking documentation. They may, in some cases, even slap a logo on the side of their truck that looks like a legitimate trucking company. They may use the DOT number of a defunct or recently bankrupt trucking company, all to make it look more legitimate. And that's an increasing problem in the U.S. and Canada in particular.
Do you think overall that cargo thefts are up? And if so, why would that be?
Yeah, it does appear that cargo thefts are up in some places. So the U.S. and Canada, there does seem to be an increase in cargo thefts. Europe holding about steady. And in some places like Brazil, for example, there does seem to be a slight decrease in cargo thefts. Of course, you're working from a very high baseline there. So a decrease
Yeah.
still means extraordinary numbers of cargo
Hmm.
thefts
Hmm.
and extraordinary amounts of cargo theft. In India, we're seeing an increase in cargo theft. So in some of those places like India, it may just be that there's more product moving around, kind of as there's the development of the middle class there, you see more desirable products moving around in those countries. In other places, due to economic downturns, we typically see an increase in theft of things like food and beverage items during those economic downturns. They're kind of essential items. People need them. They're easier to sell in the black market because they don't have serial numbers. The evidence of the theft is literally consumed. And there's less of a
Yeah.
concern around being able to track those items. If you stole a bunch of computers, obviously they all connect to the internet at some point, so you're able to track those to some extent. Food, it's not the case. It's easier to sell on the black market. So we're seeing an increase in some of those items for theft, as well as PPE, gloves, masks. Those types of items are being increasingly targeted for theft in most areas of the world.
What you're describing certainly seems to suggest that efforts to prevent cargo security are lacking or inadequate at this point.
Yeah.
What's going on? I mean, I'm surprised to hear that because we hear about all kinds of tracking and tracing technology today that is supposed to alert fleet managers immediately to anything going wrong with, say, with a particular truck or something like that, and yet clearly that isn't either they're not being utilized sufficiently or in the right way, or they're too expensive. What's going on? Why are we falling short in our efforts to prevent this from happening?
Yeah, I think there's a few different explanations there. The first is that in some cases it may be too expensive to use that tracking technology. The price has come dramatically down in the past 10 or 15 years. But in some cases, it's still too expensive, and especially for those food and beverage shipments where their margins are very slim to begin with. And for the carriers themselves, logistics and transportation is a pretty brutal industry in terms of margins and things like that. So there's not much of an incentive necessarily to put a tracking device on a $40,000 load of food the same way there is for $1 million load of pharmaceuticals or phones, for example. So in some cases, it may be too expensive. In other cases, as you mentioned, that those types of technologies may not be appropriately used. There's not the necessary kind of follow-up procedures there. There's not the training for the people involved, whether that's the drivers or the people at the warehouses who are handing this freight over, in terms of their awareness of, this looks like a situation that could be dangerous for theft. And then even if there is a tracking device and responding to the alerts that are generated from that tracking device, there may not be enough sort of policy and procedure around that to make sure that it's effective. And the other thing too is just sort of, negligence on the part of carriers and drivers in some cases. I mentioned in the US, for example, one of the most common forms of theft that we see for full truckloads is, driver leaves the truck running with the keys inside and doesn't lock the vehicle or anything like that.
Unbelievable that would happen in this day and age.
Yeah. But fortunately, things like that are easier to remedy and don't necessarily require technology to fix. It's really just a question of better training, being aware of if and when your drivers have those poor practices and trying to correct them as quickly as possible.
Thieves probably have many methods to determine where the loads are that they target. I'm wondering, to what extent are you also overseeing hacking into systems, cybersecurity violations that would allow a thief to go in and find out where all this stuff is?
Yeah, so in some cases, that is what's happening with those fictitious pickups. They're hacking into the systems for those carriers, or they're using phishing attacks to steal the identity of carriers. So they will basically call or email and say, "Hey, we're trying to submit an invoice or something like that and make sure that they can get paid." The person clicks on that link, and it helps kind of steal the identity of that particular carrier. So there's phishing attacks that we see that are being used for those fictitious pickup type attacks. In terms of hacking, we've also seen in Mexico, people being able to get into those systems to kind of see where cargo is going to go, where it's going to be picked up, and at what times. So that's why it's important to maintain, cybersecurity as well. Make sure that when you're auditing for security, audit for IT and cybersecurity as well. We're seeing that become an increasingly important part of securing your cargo. But there is also just kind of old school surveillance. People waiting outside of warehouses to see when trucks are going to be there to pick up certain types of goods, following loads to see where they're going. That's another thing where driver awareness can play a major role.
Hmm.
is in, telling your drivers, if you think you're being followed, call it in, and we'll decide whether to call law enforcement. Those types of things. There's definitely, cybersecurity issues are emerging, but the kind of traditional surveillance methods are not going away either.
So two different things going on here in terms of prevention. One is technology, and the other is just human effort and human attention. On the technology side, do you believe that companies are not investing sufficiently in cargo security technology? Would that be your advice for get more heavily into it than they are into it at the moment?
Yeah, I would encourage them to at least look at the cost benefit calculus for using those types of devices, and really kind of zero in on how much they're actually losing. I think for a lot of companies, it feels like, oh, we lose one or two trucks here or there. And they're not seeing the whole picture. That adds up to quite a bit of money, and higher insurance premiums for them, and also
Right.
just possible disruption to their operations. If they're not able to get things to customers on time and when they need them. So
Mhm.
think about the sort of total cost of that cargo theft, including the cost of investigating the theft, the cost of replacing that product, your potential higher insurance premiums, and you may be able to afford more technology than you think you can. Of course, you want to use that technology smartly and kind of present it to whoever has that budget in a way that makes it seem cost effective, in a way that really plays up that cost effectiveness. I
Mhm.
would also, too, a lot of technologies are getting much cheaper, and we're seeing tracking using Internet of Things devices. So rather than tracking with a GPS device that's inserted into the load, you're using the driver's phone to track. You're using the kind of logging devices that may be in the truck to track. So that further decreases the price of these tracking technologies. The other thing too is that some security measures can be very cheap, like better seals on trailers, for example, that you would need a bolt cutter to get into rather than just a plastic seal. Those
Mhm.
can be under $10 per load, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Tony, thank you so much for sounding the alarm, so to speak, on cargo security issue today. Tony Pelli of BSI, thank you so much for being with us today to talk about this crucial issue. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.